Greetings to all of you who have joined us on this Surface Trust Policy Dialogue Forum, a regular program that we have been holding for over 10 years and which attracts viewership, listenership across the region, Southern Africa, the continent and beyond in our diaspora. A special welcome to our panelists who are not so new, certainly not so new to the discourse. These are among the leading intellectuals and activists in the South African scene. You have Eddie Maloka, professor at Wits, but some of you will know him from the peer review mechanism which he managed for some years. Zima Vavi, again, no stranger to the region, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, General Secretary. Eleanor Susulu, author and activist, a niece of mine, incidentally. It's not why she's here. Tinyiko Maluleke, the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Swan University of Technology. I have special welcome to all of you, especially those who are joining us for the first time, and to say this very clearly that we chose you very carefully as people who can assist us in understanding this phenomenon, this scourge, as you've called it. We don't want to go too much into prefacing the discussion, except to highlight 4 points. The first is that we need to understand the context, historical and political context of this phenomenon, Afrophobia, Xenophobia. To understand the underlying causes, the historical backdrop, and above all, the curious intersection of Afrophobia or Xenophobia with color, race, in that the victims of Afrophobia and or Xenophobia have mainly been blacks, Africans, including even those from the northern parts of South Africa. Secondly, we want to understand from the eminent persons that were before us, especially the historians, the distinction, if any, between Afrophobia and Xenophobia, and how either of these, at least in the way they've been expressed themselves in South Africa, differ at least talking about xenophobia, differ from similar instances or incidents that we have seen across Africa previously, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and even in almost every country, there is a level of xenophobia, no doubt about that, even though not to the scale that we have seen in South Africa, the violent aspect of it. Thirdly, we want to understand what the state is doing about it in South Africa. Or put it differently, we want to know why there's such ambivalence on the part of the state. Is it to do with elections? In which case, the victims of xenophobia, Afrophobia, are so easily sacrificed. And above all, we want to see whether we can emerge out of this discussion with some policy recommendations so that we can address this scourge, at least begin addressing it. So, Professor Eddie Maloka, my dear brother, lead us.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ivo, for inviting me, and of course, also for a very provocative topic. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll express a view on it, and also recognize fellow panelists, very distinguished people in different spheres of South African society. South Africa is currently the only country in Africa where international migration has become a top issue. You could say similar to Europe and the United States of America, but however, for different reasons and in a different form. As Ivo has said, in Europe, Muslims are a prime target. In the United States, Latinos, and in South Africa, the main proponents of anti-migrant sentiments are Black Africans themselves, with the targets being fellow Africans, and the poor, as we know, are often on the front line. Just a brief touch on the migration in human history. The current international migration crisis results from a tension between two phenomena, one natural, the other human-made. Homo sapiens is a migratory species. Without migrations, humans will not be what we are today. We will be confined to one location on the African continent, not the colonization and domination our species has achieved of the entire planet and its different habitats. We will not have the rich diversity we possess from languages themselves, and of course, indeed, racial diversity among humans. Human migration has been central to the development and diffusion of wealth major religions. Judaism, you know, the whole thesis around the promised land. Buddhism is there, of course, Buddha traveling and the whole of Asia to attain enlightenment. And Christianity and Islam may and might have remained small and insignificant religions, perhaps even extinct without human migration. This natural human tendency to move and travel to distant places for various reasons is now constrained by an unnatural phenomenon, but one that has become dominant and omnipresent in the modern era, which is the Westphalian state. The Westphalian state is only a few hundred years old. By contrast, human migration is as old as the evolution of the Homo sapiens. Among its attributes, the Westphalian state has territory with defined borders, sovereignty, nations, citizens, documentation of its citizens from birth to death for control and surveillance, and of course, a repressive state apparatus to defend the interests of the ruling class and project power over its territory, borders, and citizens. As the Westphalian state regards its sovereignty as inviolable and its geographic borders as a red line, it establishes a complex system of measures to control and regulate the in and outflow of goods, services, and people in and out of its territory. Therefore, in today's world, human migration is constrained or contained by these attributes of the Westphalian state. The so-called illegal migrants are defined, one, as those who transgress borders into another state. They are non-citizens, they are targeted on nationalist grounds, and they are not documented. It's like setting up an animal border control point between the Serengeti in Tanzania and the Masai Mara in Kenya and start demanding passports from the wildebeest every time they undertake their annual migration in search of better pasture. In my language, which is Sotho, we say, which means traveling makes one wiser. In African folklore, the hero often follows a journey of departure, trial, and return. Migration is at the heart of our humanity. It has shaped us and it is wired into our brains. And human migration was central to the formation of South Africa itself, and I've divided very quickly over the South African historical periods or the evolution of South Africa into a number of periods I'll go through. For the pre-colonial period, I just want to highlight one. One is the wave of Bantu migration into parts of Southern Africa, from Central Africa about 2,000 years ago. People like me and you and most of us on this panel, we are Bantu speakers. Our ancestors are from Central Africa. The other wave of migration is, of course, occurred during the 1790s and the 1830s, the so-called Mfecane. Some people go even up to 1840s. It is remembered not only as an era of state formation in pre-colonial South Africa, with the emergence of kingdoms like Basotho Kingdom, the Zulu Kingdom. This period is also remembered for the mass region-wide migration of people it generated through fusion and fusion processes, leading to, for example, the Ndebele people moving out of South Africa to settle in what is in Zimbabwe today. And we know that the Balozi themselves, they speak Sotho because of Sotho influence that reached them during that period, the Lozi in Balozi in Zambia. South Africa is the most diverse country in Africa in terms of its demographics, complexity, racial makeup, and religious diversity. This is the result of our colonial encounter. South African whites are descendants of three stocks of white settlers. The Dutch, who arrived in 1650s, the French Huguenots about 10 decades later, and the British, of course, slow, but of course, after early in the 19th century. The colored people are the majority in the Western Cape. This is the product of the making of the Cape Society through Dutch slave trading that brought the Malay people from Asia to our shores, of course, beginning in the 16th century. And of course, they brought with them Islam as a religion. The Great Trek, or the so-called Great Trek of between 1830s and the 1840s, of course, we know it was a mass migration of between 12,000 to 14,000 Dutch descendants, the so-called Boers, farmers from the Cape, and moving into the interior of South Africa, the Free State, the Natal, and of course, what was then will later become the Transvaal. We have Indian people in South Africa, largely in Natal and Gauteng. They are descendants of Indian indentured labor, which was brought to South Africa in the 1860s by the British to work on the Natal sugar plantation farms. And then were later, of course, in the 1890s, the Indian merchants who followed them in the 1890s to and settled in parts of Gauteng. Of course, there was wave brought into our country, Islam and Hindu. Today, South Africa has the largest population of Indians of Indian descent in Africa. South Africa is also home to the largest Jewish community in Africa, found mostly in Johannesburg and Cape Town, who came to our shores in different ways from the 19th century, attracted by the diamonds and the gold mines, and from parts of Europe, and then notably from the Eastern Europe. We can add to this historical dynamic colonial wars of dispossession between the 17th century and the 20th century, which involved forced migration of African people from their lands to make way for white settlers. Let us not forget the migrant labor system to diamond mines in Kimberley from the 1860s and the gold mines in Gauteng from the 1880s. The South African economy was built by settler colonialists on the back of a migrant labor system that involved region-wide mobilization of African cheap labor across Southern Africa. Settlers also developed South Africa as a regional hub for a colonial expansion project aiming to create what they call Greater South Africa, which will extend from Cape Town to the Zambezi River. I refer to the apartheid era, the period 1948 to 1994, as the late colonial period. And at the center of the apartheid system, we remember, was the Bantustan system itself and the Group Areas Act, which among others involve forced removal of Black communities and the enforcement of influx control measures to prevent Black people from settling in cities. We should also include in this period the 30-year exile of liberation movements from the 1960s, during which thousands of South Africans were forced to flee the country to seek refuge in the neighboring countries, including Zimbabwe. And then for the post-apartheid era, during the colonial period in South Africa, the only foreign African national were, of course, the migrant workers, mostly from Lesotho and Mozambique. And Botswanas and the Swazis, they were not as migrant labor in the migrant labor space as were the Basutus and the Mozambicans. However, this changed significantly with the end of apartheid and, of course, the lifting of influx control, the Group Areas Act, and so on. Still, even during Mbeki and Zuma presidencies, what we refer now here as xenophobic attacks were isolated incidents. In recent years, however, they have become more frequent and more violent. Anti-African migrant social movements have also emerged with a significant following and a leadership that have become emboldened, openly espousing xenophobic views which resonate with the views of the white supremacists and the white right in the United States and Europe. Political parties, and so you can say some of them, have joined the chorus, with some relying on xenophobic messaging as their main political mobilization tool. And I want to quickly, before I close, to talk about the paradox of Pan-African citizenship. And you know, the paradox of Pan-African citizenship, it is centered on the notion of a borderless geographic space within which there is free movement of African people from the Cape to Cairo. And of course, that we also include the diaspora, the African diaspora, expressing their right of return principle to our continent within a federal political arrangement of the United States of Africa. But its actualization is constrained by three realities. One, we do not have a United States of Africa, even in the form of the African Union, which remains largely an intergovernmental body, not a federal entity. Two, the 1964 Cairo Summit of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, formally adopted a resolution to accept and respect the colonial borders existing on the day of independence for African nations. And this principle is enshrined in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. All AU member states are Westphalian states and are jealously protective of their Westphalian attributes. So the Pan-African citizen exists only in the aspirational realm, not in tangible reality. We are Pan-African in our outlook and aspirations, but legally each one of us carries different national passports. The African Westphalian states' attributes include sovereign, equality of and independence of states, respect of borders existing on its achievement of independence, non-interference in internal affairs of member states, peaceful, prosperous, and economic democratic governance, and in official pronouncements, each state has accepted a moral or its moral and political obligation to provide for their citizens, provide public goods, jobs, etc. The problem arises because we don't have peace everywhere on our continent. Conflicts and political instability displace people. We don't have prosperity everywhere on our continent due to uneven economic development, such reality generates economic migrants. And many African Westphalian states are also unable to fulfill their moral and political obligation to their citizens to adequately provide public goods. But because the Homo sapien is a migratory species, African people caught in this reality migrate in search of greener pastures. And since the international migrant is a rational actor, the tendency is for these African migrants to move to certain countries where they believe they have a better chance of an improved life. And these countries, as we know, are few on our continent. This burden then falls unevenly on a select few countries which must provide public goods not only to their citizens, but also to the African migrant. This results in competition and sometimes violent clashes at community level in countries bearing this burden over jobs, access to public goods, etc., between local citizens and African migrants. Since the decision to migrate takes place at household level, family level, rather than at the state level, Migration trends tend to follow a chaotic pattern, and this can be overwhelming on a country that is a popular destination for migrants. Just as a country can be popular for a popular destination for migrants, it can similarly attract international criminal networks. It can also attract hustlers, small business entrepreneurs, and informal traders. If the country does not have effective measures to regulate this inflow, the impact on locals and the small business sector can be overwhelming. In the South African case, South Africa is one of the few countries carrying this unevenly shared burden of providing public goods and jobs to both its citizens and the African migrant. The South African state has not just the moral and political responsibility to provide for its citizens, but also a constitutional obligation. We are at this event because of violent clashes happening in South African streets between the national citizen and the African migrant. This violent phenomenon in South Africa is not state-directed, unlike in some cases in the US and Europe. Currently, it persists as a sporadic grassroots issue, often triggered by specific incidents. The South African state faces a crisis of its own, separate from this migration issue we're discussing today. One, there is a governance crisis in South Africa, which has worsened since the state capture period and continues to deepen, centered around the failure to establish an aspirational state that in official documents is described as an ethical, developmental, and capable state. Two, public trust in government is at an all-time low, with service delivery protests happening daily. The economy is not growing as expected, barely at 1% rate. Unemployment is high, especially among the youth. Public sector corruption seems to be continuing unabated, and the ANC's electoral dominance has dissipated. And three, our cities are overwhelmed by internal migration from rural areas, which is exerting pressure on local governance systems and the state capacity to provide public goods. What is to be done? We need a Pan-African approach. This is my recommendation. Currently, the South African government and governments of affected African migrant countries are talking past each other. Affected governments are horrified by images of their citizens being chased through South African streets by angry mobs armed with machetes. Meanwhile, the South African government knows what is happening in Black communities, but struggles to communicate their situation for fear of appearing xenophobic, and privately feels unfairly targeted by their colleagues on the African continent. Aside from public condemnation of South Africa, there is no evidence that any affected African government has ever sent an investigative team to conduct an on-site study of triggers involving their nationals of these violent outbreaks. We should go back to the idea of convening an AU-led Pan-African multilateral conference on this matter. A one-way approach that leaves the country hosting migrants to hang dry and cry alone has limitations. We need a Pan-African approach where all of us will be there and own this problem collectively, the host country, sending countries, and transit countries. The Pan-African Conference route should be accompanied by multi-sectoral civil society engagements, both within individual countries and across the continent. And deliberations at this Pan-African Conference should be informed by evidence-based research, not just media reports. In the medium term, we should work towards creating a Pan-African response or some sort of an oversight mechanism akin to those implemented by the African Union and the regional economic communities when you are dealing with incidents of unconstitutional change of government, and of course also how we respond, mechanisms we use to respond to post-election political instability within a member state. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, post-apartheid South Africa's contact with the African migrant is relatively new, just under a generation old. It has had a profound impact that Black communities were not adequately prepared for. The government has also been slow and mostly reactive in its response. What we need is a more strategic and a better organized response with a Pan-African component. Two actions we must avoid, Mr. Chairman, in my view, and this is based by experiences from Europe or in Europe and the United States. We should not turn migration issue into a political mobilization project. And two, we should avoid to develop philosophical and ideological justification with published literature and public intellectuals all over television, rationalizing our hostility towards the African migrant. We should also avoid two denialisms. We should also avoid two denialisms. One, that there is no xenophobia in South Africa, and two, that there are no material basis for xenophobic attacks in South Africa, that this is a manufactured crisis, and that these are acts, baseless acts of wild xenophobic lunatics. My last word, can we describe the South African situation as xenophobic or Afrophobic? My preferred description is international migration governance crisis. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Eddie, for that outline. I think you just answered everything, explained everything. Most of all, I think we'll find your recommendations subject for the. But thank you for putting out things as they should be. Just one question before I move on to the next speaker. You said so far the xenophobia or Afrophobia is not state-directed. I sent you a video this afternoon of police action in Cape Town this afternoon. I sent to all of the panelists. Someone sent it to me. Is this a new development in South Africa towards state-directed action against so-called illegal migrants? Is this the first incident?
Yeah, we can discuss that after Eleanor's presentation, because she's going to talk about a presentation will focus on state response. And maybe we can talk a little bit more I think narrowly by not state directed. I mean, it's not, you can hear the message and measures, you can see them happening in parts of Europe where there is even a repressive state, you could say military armed elements or paramilitary armed elements, yes, deployed in the streets. So we don't have something similar to that. But perhaps maybe an overzealous response by cops who are, I'm not sure, but it's not formally a government response to do what ISIS do. We don't have an ICE phenomenon, and we also don't have the what that is you find in the United States, just an office focus on mass deportation and all of that. We just have a more like the traditional approach you find in many countries on how to deal with issues of migration and so. But we can talk more about this. I have not thought about it more, but I know I was in government myself. I know that it's not government.
No, I think basically for me, I was also surprised to see this state involvement at the level of police. I checked twice the video, and they were actually wearing police uniform, and they were attacking only black would be illegal. I don't know how they knew they were illegal, but they were very violent.
No, maybe me, I would have been attacked if I was there. Remember, I've got a West African height, so we'll talk about it later.
And you behave like a West African too. So anyway, so let's move on to Zwelinzima Vavi. Welcome, Vavi.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Ibo, you chairing this session. And firstly, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this critical discussion at this critical conjuncture in South Africa, where the headlines are almost occupied by this phenomenon of Afrophobia, xenophobia, social fragmentization, and violent scapegoating. We approach this discussion obviously from the standpoint of the working class, or from the standpoint of Pan-Africanism and constitutionalism and human dignity. And we must say from onset that we see no justification whatsoever for violence against migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, or foreign nationals in general. there can never be any kind of justification for mob justice, for vigilantism, for assaults, destruction of homes and businesses, or the dehumanization of the African people. And this is the point we want to emphasize in this discussion, and we emphasize every day in our public statements. No worker from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Lesotho, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Somalia, Bangladesh, the DRC, or any other country is responsible for the structural crisis of South Africa's capitalism. The real crisis is the failing economic system that has produced mass unemployment, inequality, poverty, corruption, deindustrialization, and hopelessness. So we want to go back to the point we have been raising for the past 15 to 20 years, that South Africa is sitting on a social time bomb. Today, South Africa has perhaps one of the highest unemployment rates in the whole world amongst the industrializing nations. Using the expanded definition, millions, now 13 million of our people who are Black, who are the working class, who are the Black youth and Black women, remain excluded from the economic participation. Entire communities are trapped in permanent insecurity. Just imagine 80% of the unemployed 10 million people, using the expanded definition of unemployment, have been unemployed for more than 1 year. It's a structural unemployment crisis. Linked to that, we're seeing collapsing municipalities, rising hunger. 17 to 20 million South Africans skip a meal a day, most probably at night, not because they are in some slimming program, but because there's just no food for them. 10,000 of our kids die of malnutrition every day, or every year rather. 27% of our kids are stranded. There's overcrowding at school. We are reversing the strides that we saw in the first 10 or 20 years of our democracy. We are seeing a deepening housing crisis, now estimated to be 3.7 units. We are seeing electricity and water insecurity across the country. We're seeing casualization and labor brokering, or the phenomenon of the precariety. We're seeing stagnating wages in South Africa, just as it is the case all over the world. We're seeing worsening inequality. We're seeing rising food and transport cost. So South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world, indeed. And in this environment, there is deep levels of frustration, of anger, of desperation, which is inevitable if you look at the disappointed expectation, as well as the feelings of betrayal that are just. And we come from the perspective that says those levels of anger, of frustration, are justified in the context of what is happening on the ground. But here is our problem, and this is the point again we want to put across. Instead of confronting the economic system and the political failures that create this catastrophe, sections of our society are redirecting that anger towards migrants and foreign nationals. And this is what is dangerously a new phenomenon in the South Africa's levels of frustration. We leave the architectures of this inequality, poverty, unemployment, corruption almost untouched, as suddenly new heroes are rising out of this crisis, where the liberation movement first has weakened itself so fundamentally, where the trade unions themselves are no longer what they used to be at least in the beginning of the first 20 years of our democracy. And the absence of a strong civil society formation, the absence of a strong unity between the unemployed and the employed workers creates a vacuum that is now being filled by opportunists and, frankly, by lumpen elements of society, redirecting that anger away from where it should be directed to the other most vulnerable sections of the working class who happen to be wearing a tag of migrant. So let me deal with the second theme of I felt that we needed to touch on. That migrants did not create the South African crisis. We must confront that dangerous myth honestly. Migrants did not collapse Eskom. They did not loot municipalities dry. They did not make Hillbrow what it looks like today. They didn't make Umtata and or Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth what it looks like today in comparison to the colonial era. They did not destroy the rail infrastructure. They did not privatize public services. They did not impose pro-rich policies such as austerity and privatization. They did not shut down the factories. They didn't weaken the labor inspectors. They did not capture the state, or they did not steal billions through corruption, including through illicit cash outflows, mispricing, and all of the tax dodging schemes that cost the South African economy billions and billions of rands. Workers from elsewhere in Africa did not create neoliberal economic policies. They did not create the job loss bloodbath. They did not create the warehouse economy where South Africa's imports, or where South Africa imports what it once produced. They did not create the destruction of the manufacturing capacity. Comrade Ibo, we've lost 50% of the manufacturing capacity in South Africa between 1994 and today. In 1994, the manufacturing sector contributed somewhere between 22 and up to 23% to the GDP. And today, it is below 12%. Just this past year alone, we have lost 127,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector. In fact, many migrants themselves are victims of the same system of exploitation. Many are fleeing wars, dictatorship, climate disasters, including in our region, sanctions, underdevelopment, imperialist destabilization in the DRC, in the Sudan, in Somalia, the debt crisis imposed through the structural adjustment programs, as well as the economic collapse because of mismanagement of our economies by the elites that we elected into power. The African working class is being displaced across borders by the crisis produced by both local elites and the global capitalist system. That's a second theme. The third theme we want to raise and debate today is that the real beneficiaries from the current divisions amongst the working class is capital. It is the ruling elites. It is those that are occupying the leading heights of economy in South Africa, in particular, in this particular instance. And that the working class must understand that division amongst workers will always benefit the exploiting class. Capital has historically used migrant labor to weaken worker unity, to drive down wages, to bypass labor laws, and to fragment communities. This is not new. Under colonialism and apartheid, Southern African labor migration was deliberately engineered to supply cheap labor to mines, to farms and industry. The migrant labor system was foundational to racial capitalism in Southern Africa as a whole. Today, employers still exploit undocumented and desperate workers because they know that vulnerable workers are easier to underpay, to intimidate, and to exploit at will. The solution, therefore, is not to attack the victims of migration. The solution is to organize all workers into the trade unions, is to enforce labor laws equally, is to stop exploitation, is to strengthen trade unions, is to criminally prosecute exploitative employers taking advantage of the vulnerability of workers from the region, and is to rebuild the state capacity. We always insist an injury to one worker must remain an injury to all workers. The state, and that's a fourth theme, the state has simply failed to manage migration humanly and effectively. We must also be honest that this state is a failing state. And a lot of people say, oh, we have already arrived at a failed revolution in South Africa. Others are saying we are at a doorstep in front of a building written boldly, failed state, failed revolution. Yes, a lot of debate is necessary about the extent of where the road is putting the liberation struggle in South Africa today. But this is what is undeniable. The Home Affairs is dysfunctional. It is overwhelmed. Do you believe and do you know that South Africa only has 37% of workers that it needs to employ in the Home Affairs? Loads of corruption exposed almost every month, of officials selling IDs, passports, marriage certificates, everything. So there's a crisis there. Refugee system is collapsing. Documentation backlogs, even amongst South Africans, is at frightening level. The minister, Aaron Motsoaledi, now the Minister of Health again, estimated that there are about 4 million undocumented South Africans. Imagine then what should be the crisis in relation to asylum seekers standing in our borders and waiting to be granted permission to come in line with our international obligations. So the border management is inconsistent. The labor inspectors are weak. Municipal planning has failed to keep even with an increasing rate of urbanization in South Africa. How much more about migration from the rest of the African continent? The result then is chaos, is fear, is criminal syndicates and rising tensions in communities. But when the state fails, vigilant groups cannot replace the constitution, cannot suddenly impose a responsibility on themselves to be police or labor inspectors or even home affairs officials. None of them have a right to assault people as it is currently happening. None of them are legally entitled to conduct raids, to force removals, or to act as self-appointed immigration officers. If laws are being broken, lawful institutions must act within the Constitution and human rights framework. Otherwise, society descends into lawlessness. And let's repeat this. The reason why 2008 in South Africa, the xenophobic attacks in 2008 happened in the first place is because they were driven by impunity, by the belief amongst the vigilante groups that they have a full backing of the state, of the police, and of the elites in society who are retweeting and who are repeating their xenophobic messages in the social media, and who are telling them that they must press on and drive and clean. That's what they're saying. Clean our society, as if migrants represent some kind of cockroaches, as the phenomenon that we saw in Rwanda conflict. If the state would have taken a strong action against the people who repeatedly beat up people in the streets, this current wave of Afrophobia and Xenophobia would have been stopped long time ago. The fifth area that we wanted to conclude with is that we must, as we debate this complex and difficult challenge of migration, of xenophobia and Afrophobia, as a progressive movement, as the left, we must always avoid two dangerous extremes. One extreme is to pretend that migration pressures do not create real social and economic strain in poor communities already facing underemployment, unemployment, housing shortages, and collapsing services. There is an unbelievable squeeze on the ground. There is an intense competition for scarce resources. There is developing anger and frustrations that can easily be used by the xenophobes to turn workers against other workers. To deny that squeeze and that level of desperation by us as the progressive forces is to deny the lived realities of the working class communities. That's one extreme. We can say, no, there is no pressure. The other extreme is to scapegoat migrants for every social crisis and adopt authoritarian politics of hatred, of deportations, of vigilantism and collective punishment. The road leads then to fascism and barbarism, which is currently, unfortunately, what is unfolding in South Africa. Goodness me, you are not as active on the social media space as I am, who have to endure an insult for every moment you put up the real facts of the crisis in South Africa that have absolutely nothing to do with migration, but everything to do with a failing democratic order that have betrayed the aspirations of the majority of society. You will be shocked at the levels of backwardness. You will be shocked at the levels of insults these xenophobes are throwing at the slightest misunderstanding of the message you are trying to put through. And you will be shocked about the levels of scapegoating of the crisis that have not been created by anybody else. So yes, anybody misunderstanding, and I normally say to comrades, let's not underestimate, but let's also not overplay the crisis we are facing. All of the marches, and I've lived marching, I normally say to everybody, I started to march immediately after the death of Steve Biko in 1978, and I've never stopped organizing marches. It's been over 40 years of repeating the same thing. But I know when something is small and it is generated through social media. And I've seen all of the marches from Durban to Johannesburg. They look very, very big, but not a single of the marches have climbed more than 10,000 participation levels. Not at all. The march in Umtata was a dam sweep. The march in East London was hardly a 1,500 people. The march everywhere else are not attracting the type of marches that we should be organizing as the left against unemployment, poverty, and inequalities. But at the same time, we can't dismiss the fact that there are about 10,000 people in Durban or in Johannesburg so angry and so willing to scapegoat the crisis and the squeeze they are facing on the victims of mismanagement of the economies somewhere else in the African continent. So we can't go to the extreme of ignoring everything. Nor can we go back to Marx, who once declared that there is no worker that have a country. Workers have no country, to quote him. Marx never meant that workers must ignore material realities of uneven development or responsibilities of the state to regulate migration humanly and fairly. Equally, Donald Trump's style politics of high walls, of heightened electricity voltages, of mass deportations and nationalist scapegoating offer no solution to underdevelopment. So South Africa cannot deport itself out of unemployment, inequality, and corruption. And lastly, South Africa cannot develop alone, surrounded by the sea of poverty and underdevelopment. Poverty anywhere else in our region will always be a source of instability everywhere. The wars must end. Unemployment must be attacked. Dictatorships must be defeated. The climate collapse in South Africa, Mozambique, in Zimbabwe and Zambia must be dealt with properly. And underdevelopment persisting across the continent must be stopped in the bud, or else migration will simply continue to happen. Even the highest of the walls, the militarized borders of mass deportations, will not stop human beings from searching for survival. People migrate because conditions push them to migrate. No one will leave their kids for fun and risk crossing a Kruger National Park with hyenas, leopards, elephants, buffaloes, and lions. Only a man driven into desperation, who have listened to the cries of his own child for 6 days going without food, goes to the desperation of swimming through the Limpopo River infected by crocodiles. Migration is often a symptom of deeper structural failures in one country and or in another country. So what is to be done? We need a developmental economic program that can create jobs. We need a strong enforcement against exploitative employers. We need an equal labor rights for all workers. We need to rebuild state capacity. We need a continental developmental agenda, not that NEPAD strategy imposed by the former president, Thabo Mbeki, which was frankly neoliberalism exported to the entire African continent. We need working class unity. We need solidarity. We need trade unions that are stronger, civil societies that are stronger, church movements and religious organizations that are stronger, youth structures, and progressive formations that actively confront xenophobia and Afrophobia politically and ideologically. Thank you very much for inviting me, comrades, and we will engage throughout the night. Thank you.
Thanks, Vavi. That's a real manifesto, not only of the working people, but of all migrants. It's a very powerful statement. I've been reading your work on social media, and therefore no surprise that we invited you, and you've laid it out as plainly as possible. Passionate, and fortunately this is recorded. It's on YouTube, and even after this session, the many people will be visiting it. We have an average 30,000 now who visit our website. Thank you, and I hope you will be able to send us that paper at your convenience. For now, I'll let you rest and move on to Eleanor. But I'll be back to you towards the end. Welcome, Eleanor.
Thanks very much, Ivo. Thank you very much. And I must thank the previous speakers for outlining issues in such an instructive, powerful, and passionate way. I'm not going to, so I don't have to repeat a lot of things. I think I agree with the analysis totally. We'll just highlight a few of the things that may not have been mentioned. So I first of all want to say that gender-based violence is another crisis in South Africa and the region generally. And the Afrophobic attacks actually make women more vulnerable. Because if you have vigilante groups, they can check people's documentation, have free reign over people in the way that these vigilante groups are doing, then of course women are more vulnerable in the process. So I want to put that out there. I also want to say, clearly we're talking about Afrophobia. I think we should even drop xenophobia. We should say Afrophobia or anti-African migrant. And in fact, when you look at the people who were killed in 2008, and since the sporadic murders that have happened, it has been Africans and to a lesser extent Asians have been targeted. So I think that is something that we just need to say out front there, that it's Africans. And where among Africans, the darker you are, the more vulnerable you will be. Where Eddie joked that he's tall like a West African. We know that there are Africans that have been South Africans who have been targeted, asked to produce papers purely based on their complexions. So let us call it what it is. It's Afrophobia, it's anti-African migration. And I want to make one recommendation that is very easy for us. Let us drop calling people foreign nationals. Let us call Africans Africans. Let us call them African migrants, or Malawians, or Zimbabweans, or Mozambican, whatever they are. Nkosazana Zuma recently at a book launch said, foreign nationals, Africans are Africans. We shouldn't have an African being foreign in Africa. And actually this expression foreign nationals, I think, is something that we must look at because it's peculiar to South Africa. I've never heard it anywhere else on the continent. People will talk about fellow Africans. So maybe that conscious effort to change language is important. You asked me to talk about the state and the response of the state. Maybe I should say that the response of the state has been increasingly ambivalent. Early ANC was very clear against Afrophobia, against attacks of African migrants. 2008, the attacks that happened, unfortunately, within the state, there was collusion with the groups, the vigilante groups within the state. There was the there was Afrophobia within state structures, especially the police. So that fueled those kind of attacks. But I think we must also talk about the political tradition, or in South Africa, you had the 1990s black on black violence. And in many ways, this is those forms of attacks which were at the time on township residents, people from the hostels, that is the form that it is taking now, and also from this almost the same sources. So I think that that is something that we must look at. I want to focus on 3 politicians, just commenting on them briefly and different ways of responding. There's the denialism, and I really want to call out Thabo Mbeki on this. I was very upset to hear him denying and saying that this is criminality and that South Africans cannot be xenophobic. There are 40 million South Africans, so you can't speak and say South Africans are xenophobic, or they are not xenophobic, or they are not Afrophobic. There is a section of South African society that is violently Afrophobic, and we cannot deny that. So I think it's unfortunate that former President Mbeki would talk in this way, especially since he is a person who has been strong about the diaspora, about recognizing African identity from the continent and beyond, and recognizing the diaspora as part of the continent. So I think that was unfortunate, and that denialism doesn't help the efforts to counteract the scourge. Then the next politician is Gayton McKenzie, and it's a source of deep pain and distress that we have such a person as a Minister of Arts and Culture in South Africa. Gayton McKenzie said very clearly he supports Donald Trump, and he supports what Donald Trump is doing with ICE, and he would like to have that ICE here and have the policy of Magahambe, let them go. And it's unfortunate that this is in arts and culture, where arts and culture is an instrument to important tool to counteract Afrophobia and anti-migrant sentiments. The third politician I want to comment on is Julius Malema. I'm not an admirer of Julius Malema. In fact, I've been very critical of him. But he is the one politician who has spoken courageously and actually confronted anti-populist feeling by saying we are Africans, and if we cannot be attacking Zimbabweans, Malawian, Mozambicans, because we will end up being attacked ourselves, because once those people are gone, we will turn against each other. And I think Julius Malema's pronouncements on this issue have been very progressive. I'm saying as a head of a political party, as compared to the others. There is a white supremacist, neo-Nazi global project. We cannot deny that. And unfortunately, those that talk about white genocide are the very ones who would promote this kind of fighting amongst Black people. And we need a resurgence, a rebuilding of Black consciousness, especially among the youth. I agree with Eddie's recommendations on a conference and evidence-based research. I agree with Comrade Bavi's recommendations. I would go further to say we need a rebuilding of civil society. I was part of civil society efforts in 2008 and countering and dealing with the crisis. And again in 2010, people may not be aware that there was a plan for large-scale attacks in 2010 in the run-up to the World Cup. It was terrifying. And we worked with the South African Council of Churches, with the interfaith community, and a range of civil society organizations, as well as with the UNHCR. And perhaps that is some historical record that must be captured. And there were people very courageous South Africans, like the former late Reverend Sipotes, the late Florence Nkwashu, who really went out of their way to put their lives in danger. I remember a Mozambican was killed. Sipotes accompanied the body, arranged for the funeral right up to Mozambique to the family and apologized. So there has been work that has been done. Unfortunately, those civil society movements and those social justice networks that existed have been decimated by the very things that Vavi talks about: poverty, crisis of electricity, crisis of employment. So those people who would stand up have been deactivated. And I see an investment that should happen in civil society. And here I would target South African corporates who are operating across the rest of the continent, who feel the backlash and the anger in the rest of the continent against what is happening to their citizens in South Africa. And that these corporates need to stand up and they need to invest in social justice programs, in solidarity building programs in South Africa. Ibo, I wrote you a letter on your birthday acknowledging how you made sure I went to Senegal. I was part of a group that studies in Senegal, and my experience of Pan-African solidarity in Senegal. And that really is something that has influenced me. And when I look at young people here, and this is a discussion we have had with people of our generation who traveled around the continent during the anti-apartheid movement and had this experience of international solidarity, that for young people in South Africa now, or in the region generally, that experience of solidarity is not, they don't have the kind of exposure that we have. And there are no young people being sent from South Africa to study in Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria or East Africa. So the building of the next generation of Pan-Africanists with the exposure to other people in Africa is not happening. At a meeting in 2008 that Graça Machel Foundation organized in Mozambique, addressing this very issue, young working class people there said, we need to communicate as working class people. We need to organize across borders, regionally and continentally, and we don't have that opportunity. There are very strong and committed, passionate working class activists here in South Africa, but they virtually demobilized by poverty. So for me, one of the things of building this is actually investing in this cohort of young people that will do the solidarity work, going apart from anti-migration, anti-Afrophobic projects in South Africa, have solidarity with Sudan, with Gaza, with Cuba, because all these things are related. We are facing a tsunami. AI is going to bring a tsunami of joblessness. That is something also that needs to be addressed and is going to heighten and is going to exacerbate this crisis that we're experiencing. So we need an army of young people that are working full-time on these issues. And it's one of my concerns that how are we going to make this happen? And how are we going to get this investment? On the South African issue, I should say the other thing is the SABC. I think the SABC, especially its Channel Africa, SABC has been diminished. It has struggled. It has had bad leadership. It has had disinvestment. But I think it's really important as for the kind of historical education messaging, for example, that Eddie and Vavi have given. That kind of messaging going out on the SABC, Channel Africa being used as a channel to promote African solidarity, African cooperation, African discourse. The Europeans are moving away from American tech. And I think as Africans, we need to be building a pro-African messaging. you know, we've worked on anti-xenophobic campaigns or anti-Afrophobic, but I've realized it's not enough to say we're working against this and this is wrong. We have to promote an African identity, even a regional identity. We talk about this problem, but we don't actually mention that Botswana, Namibia, to a lesser extent, Eswatini and Lesotho have been dealing with migration from the rest of the region, especially Zimbabwe. And actually, if you look at Botswana in terms of population, they actually probably have a higher percentage of migrants than South Africa and would feel more threatened with the small population they have. These are the kind of things that are not in the consciousness of ordinary South Africans or working class South Africans. And so we need to make this, need to invest in this. And I would recommend you get Tessa Dooms at some time. You've had her before, because she's working on podcast where she's dealing with these issues. So really, I feel that for the solutions, we need to build Pan-Africanism. Putuma Nhleko has written this book, The Invisible People, and he talks about Africa as a almost invisible continent and how to counter Africa's position in the world. And one of the things he says is building an African identity. But he doesn't just actually talk how. What are the challenges of Pan-Africanism and your generation of Pan-Africans, Igbo, who are aging and are not being replaced by a new and vibrant generation, because people are so battered and bruised and just trying to survive. So I think that's the challenge, to actually develop a huge cadre, a civil society cadre that is going to confront the state, confront the failures of the state and the corruption that is part of what is fueling this, and actually build a positive, make young people be working positively on social justice, solidarity, and Pan-African connections. I think I'll stop there.
No, thanks, Eleanor.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very powerful. There's no xenophobia. It's Afrophobia. It's really an indictment. And the point you made here, really, it's peculiar to South Africa, and we need to examine the foundations of that. Africans being anti-African. Can you imagine?
But can I say this, Ibo? Can I say this? Because Eddie talked about evidence-based research. I think there really needs to be more research on the forms of violence that took place in the late 80s, early 90s, the so-called black-on-black violence, and how those forms have been activated against migrants. I think it's something that actually has to be investigated in some detail.
Okay. Yes. So, Tiniko, we have been listening to all of it. Now for you to help us put things together before we go back to the rest of the panelists. The issue of pertinent, I've noted here, Afrophobia as distinct from xenophobia. The role of the state and denialism. We have seen it through social media and the statements being made by politicians. It's incredible, not to mention this Mackenzie chap. I don't know if you're aware that there is a narrative in Zimbabwe. His name in Zimbabwe is Garikai Mainzenise from Gweru, where you grew up. So, are you aware of that? Garikai Mainzenise.
No.
Yes, it's everywhere. So, then the need for a framework for confronting Afrophobia, and Eleanor has touched on that. Enormous work has been done, educating, and I have had discussions with my colleagues in the education sector, people like Blaine Zimande. What is the nature of the education, the curriculum, that 30 years after the end of apartheid, people, Africans, call others foreign Africans. I mean, I used to meet even the working class people. I say, "Are you from Africa?" You know, incredible. There's a big task ahead. What worries me is that 30 years into post-apartheid, we still have this phenomenon. You know, you don't see it anywhere. By the way, I've been all over Africa. I've lived everywhere, and it's new to us what we see in South Africa. It's completely peculiar to South Africa. And South Africans need to know that the future of Pan-Africanism. So, Tinyiko Maluleke.
Yeah. Thank you very much. What do you say after such incisive and insightful inputs from colleagues who are not just theorists, but actually deeply involved in the activism against xenophobia? I mean, Zweli, you can tell that he's not just talking from the head, he is talking from the heart and from the trenches. And that is moving because we are not going to deal with the problem of xenophobia, Afrophobia, if all we do is theorize it. And that's not to say theory is unimportant, because even behind the violence that we see, there is a theory that is informing the people. So you have to deal with that ghost, even as you want to deal with the actual blood and gore that is in front of you. Because until you deal with the theory that informs the activities, you have just done half the job. Now, I wish my Greek was better than it is, because xenophobia is really fear for strangers. I don't know what you call fear for people who look like you. I suppose the closest is Afrophobia. But what we're dealing with is hate and fear for people who look like us. That is at the heart of what is going on here. It's not the fear of strangers. There is nothing strange about the people that are at the receiving end of the violence and the anger in South Africa. There's nothing stranger about them. If anything, it is because they feel and resonate with who we are and what we look like. And for some reason, that is precisely why there is so much antipathy and hate for them. Last year, I published my rather strange memoir. Some have said it's not a memoir. And when they said that, they affirm what I was trying to do in some ways. And the last chapter of my memoir is titled "The Day That I Die." And in that chapter, I paint a picture of me dying at the squatter camp somewhere outside Tembisa, where I will be killed for being a Shangaan. It's a thought that has been with me since 2008, when Ernesto Nyamoave, the Mozambican man, was burnt to death with people dancing all around him at a township in the East Rand. And if you go to some of the examples that Vavi was giving of the marches that we see, the diabolical marches that we are seeing across the country now, so-called anti-immigrant marches. The soundtrack of the recent Eastern Cape march was Shangaan Sugendleleni, and that was the song that was being sung, Shangaan, get out of the way. Now, the problem is that if you are Shangaan, how will they be able to tell that you are the South African Shangaan and not the Mozambican Shangaan? If you are Swazi, how will they tell that you are a South African Swazi and not a Swaziland Swazi? Is there any difference really? Do they smell differently? Is the shape of their noses different? Or is it arbitrary things like Eleanor was saying, so you are darker, therefore you must be a Mosotho from Lesotho, or you are, I don't know, you walk in a particular way, therefore you must be Zimbabwean. It's a very strange set of circumstances that we find ourselves in the country at the moment. I really appreciate what Eddie was saying about migration being a human phenomenon, and that the Westphalian state is not the only form of state we know, or we have experienced, or we have a choice of. And I loved the way he went back into the history of Pan-Africanism, both as a mirror to look at, but also as an ideal through which we could be able to overcome the problem that we are facing at the moment. Now, I also think if you remove migration from the world, certainly from South Africa, you are left with very little. I mean, if you think about it, the history of migration is what informs the most powerful literature in the world, whether you're talking about The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz, which is a children's story, it's about leaving home, going away in order to find home, because the main character leaves and goes away to look for the Emerald City and the Wizard of Oz, but eventually is sent back home and finds that all the time she was looking for home. The same theme in The Alchemist of Paulo Coelho, or John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which was very, very popular during its time. Uhambo lomhambi, it was translated into isiXhosa. Or even Thomas Mofulo's Traveller to the East, which I suspect was inspired by Pilgrim's Progress rather. So if you take migration out of human experience, you will also impoverish our literature and our arts tremendously. That's why it is inane that you have a minister of arts and culture who speaks the way the current minister is speaking. Think about Mphahlele, Eskia Mphahlele's notion of exile, and not exile merely as a place, but exile as a verb, because he speaks about the tyranny of place and the tyranny of time, and being exiled from the teaching profession, being exiled from Marabastad to Maupaneng, being exiled from South Africa to Kenya to Nigeria to Paris to the USA, and that unless you understand that feeling, that place of being an exile internally, exiled from yourself also, I mean, being called a boy and a John and a Jim and so on, that unless we appreciate that, we will not be able to appreciate the real trouble we are in. And I wonder whether we as South Africans have really worked through those experiences that the likes of Mphahlele and others are talking about. Now, Zweli was saying this is a failed state, and I couldn't agree more. Failed state. I couldn't agree more. But I think we have had 30 years, 32 years now of an opportunity that has been lost, or that has been squandered. Maybe not completely lost, but definitely squandered to dangerous levels. And I wonder whether this is not the problem across the continent, that we have got these Westphalian states, 54 of them, 55 of them, which have squandered opportunities to build nations, to build people, to build democracies. And so that you have Africans wandering, if I may go back to Mpahlele again and his novel about the wanderers, across the continent, homeless within their countries, between their countries, and within themselves. Because the opportunity that we have had have been squandered. If you like, if you go back to 1958 or 55, with the first independent countries, that's how long. But if you go back to 1994 in South Africa, that is how long. And whether what we are seeing is not a symptom of squandered opportunities, and of course, the idea that Zweli brings, that it's a structural problem. It's a capital problem. It is a systemic problem, much more than just a problem of mobs and crowds who are full of hate, or hordes that are supposed to be invading South Africa or that country. That it is not about that. But it is about the structural issues we have left unattended or even allowed to exacerbate over the past 32 years in this country. We certainly have not been vigilant with our constitution or with the National Development Plan. The problems, the big problems of inequality, poverty, unemployment, and now corruption, we have to always add, are remaining largely unattended. And this being an election year, we are going to see more and more politicians becoming softer and softer on the problem of Afrophobia, because they think that's what people want to hear and they want to be voted in again. I think between now and November this year, we have not had the worst from the politicians, because all manner of populism is going to come into the fray. But what I take as a challenge again from Eddie is that perhaps this is the time when the activists, the intellectual activists, the NGO activists, the labor activists, the church activists must raise their voices in terms of speaking out against this, in spite of the attacks that will definitely come, of the kind that Zweli was talking about. I remember in 2008, I was, if you will believe me, the president of the South African Council of Churches. And I led a delegation to the union buildings, where we met with the then president, Thabo Mbeki, when we saw what was happening, and we didn't know that it would break out into the violence that we saw in 2008, but we went to warn him and to ask for government to intervene before it is too late. And we got the same story about South Africans not being xenophobic, that this was simply criminal elements in society, and that it's a police issue. Police must just deal with it and we will be fine. We were not fine, because 63, 64 lives later, a third of whom were actually South African. Not that lives must be ranked in terms of the Westphalian nation state at all. Not a single person was supposed to have died. But to show how irrational this phenomenon is, so at the end of it, you had more than 60 people dead, and more than 20 were people who died holding their South African IDs, as it were. So I really think the phenomenon that we are facing is it's a war against ourselves in many ways, because we are not dealing with the structural issues that Zweli was talking about. Maybe just a few more comments, and of course, all that manifesto that Zweli read out about the looting that was not done by migrants, the hillbillies which were not created by people coming from outside, the state capture, you name it. I couldn't agree more with that. The problem is that we are all now at the mercy, it looks to me, of these elites who are now hijacking the real pain and suffering of people for their own survival. So universities in South Africa at the moment are facing a parliamentary portfolio committee that is basically encouraging them not to employ academics who are not South African. I mean, it's a very strange phenomenon. It doesn't matter how good they are, or at least if you employ them, you must be able to go and prove to a committee in Parliament that you did the right thing, as it were. Either not to employ, but also to consider letting go of some. And the most dangerous thing to say for a vice chancellor is, of course, what I'm just saying now, because the portfolio committee will not be happy about it. But such are the times in which we are living now. And although, universities might not necessarily take immediate action, but the bullying, the psychological and ideological bullying that is taking place will certainly set us back as institutions of higher learning in this country, especially those of us who know the nature of the academic project, those of us who have studied in other countries on this continent and in the world, and who have worked in other countries and other continents across the world. We know that it's not possible to think of a university as if it were a local high school. Even a local high school is no longer as local as it was supposed to be, perhaps in the 1970s. I mean, if you go to some of our best performing high schools in this country, you'll find that part of the reason they are performing so well is because they have looked for the best possible people to come and teach and work in those schools and in the universities. So, and one thing that is often not spoken about, which is really referred to enough, is the extent to which the migrants, or whatever the term is, are being exploited by employers. The employers are not are hardly ever referred to, except, of course, with the portfolio committee and universities. They are not calling out the big capital and how much harm is being done by them. It's not often the case that is happening. It is relegated to ordinary people down there fighting amongst themselves, as if there is no structural issues and no involvement of the elites in the problem that we are facing. So indeed, the two extremes which Zweli says we must avoid, one being to pretend that there are no pressures on the ground, and the other being to blame everything on migrants. But there is a third wing to this, and that is the role of the elites in perpetuating this situation, because it is of benefit to them, and including the politicians, who are going to exploit it more and more. In fact, those who are marching these, who are leading these marches with Shangan, Sugendleleni soundtracks, are actually beneficiaries of this situation. They are not messiahs who are coming to save the poor. They need this situation to build the careers that they are at the moment trying to build. So language is important. I agree with you, Elinor. We have to think carefully about how we name what we say, the phrasing, and so on, because it excuses the act. It gives permission for people to do what they want to do. So, asu umuntu ishangan. If this is not a person, it's just a shangan. And ishangan is also a kwerekwere. Kwerekwere is someone who speaks a language we don't understand. A Shangan is a Nigerian and is also a Mozambican and is also a Zimbabwean. It's a once you allow this loose and dangerous language to go unchallenged and uncontested, you are basically giving permission for harm to be done to individuals and to families and to people. Yeah. So the only thing I would say to Eddie, so if Pan-Africanism is the solution and has been seen as part of the solution for the longest time, for the past 30 years at least, let me say for the past 60 years, if you go back to the founding of the OAU more than 60 years ago, we have always known that. Why have we not implemented this solution that we know of? So, and in a sense, you answered this question by saying there's a difference between the ideal of Pan-Africanism and the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is this Westphalian state and this growing frenzy of blaming people who look like us. They are the most, they are easy targets. They are very close to us, so we can reach them. So we can shout Pan-Africanism till we are blue in the face. As long as on the ground, the blacker you are, the less able you are to speak Zulu, the more suspect you are, even though the problem is really structural. And we don't even want to talk about the economic structure. We have now simply found the best scapegoats available. There is unemployment because there's immigration, we say, or we are told. There is inequality because there is immigration. There is poverty because there is immigration, when in fact, these are not caused by immigration. If anything, immigration could help us solve them if we were able to appreciate the kind of workforce, intellectual input that people who come into the country might be able to bring. But we are not there. At the moment, South Africa, having failed to do what it ought to have done for 32 years, has reached a stage, unfortunately, where we are looking for scapegoats. And the easiest ones are those whom we call foreign nationals, African foreign nationals, as Elinor rightly pointed out, that we should let go of this diabolic term. Thank you very much. The reason I chose to respond is because I'm traveling around the country, handing over degrees to students who might never get jobs, even though I tell them that they must not give up on education and that they must not wait for someone to give them a job and so on. But the reality is it's tough. So I'm now sitting in a hotel somewhere because I'm going to do a graduation tomorrow in Bombela. Thanks very much, Ibo.
No, Tinyuko, this is more than we expected from a respondent. there are no respondents on this program. We are all interactively involved. You did a profound job, really, and you have highlighted this point. And unfortunately, we've just limited time now, and we have just to sum up. And Eleanor has had to leave for another assignment. But so I just want to draw this to a close by just asking one or two questions, to which I wish the three of you could respond quickly, beginning with you, Tinyiko. There are two problems. One is the structural that Vavi has explained so clearly, in the condition of the economic conditions, social conditions in South Africa, and indeed the failure of the post-apartheid dispensation so far. That's one, but that doesn't explain the causes, the underlying cause of Afrophobia. Let's make that very clear. If also because much of the denialism that we get from politicians seems to hinge around the pressure on facilities, on services, and so on and so forth. That's I want to say very clearly. I mean, I've been to a number of conferences on this problem in South Africa, but also as a sociologist, I'm acutely aware of the peculiar nature of this Afrophobia, and you explained it so well. The hate and fear of people who look like us, who live close to us, whom we live with, for that matter. It's the most profound definition of Afrophobia. And you find this almost peculiar to South Africa. Would you care to explain that briefly, Tinyiko?
Yeah, obviously, beyond the economic explanations, there is a sort of psychosocial explanation for where we are. After hundreds of years of colonialism and nearly 80 years of apartheid, 70 or more, we shouldn't think that the minds of South Africans have not been messed up. I think that the damage that has been done to our psyches, our minds, being a theologian, I almost said also our souls, cannot be underestimated. You know, when I was growing up, there was the tendency to buy these lotions and creams to lighten one's skin, and it was supposed to make people look better because their skin was lighter. That practice may have diminished, but the psychology of it is still here. I believe there is intense hatred, self-hate, hatred for ourselves in South Africa. And we are dealing wrongly with the legacy of that psychological damage that apartheid has done on us. And even the level of corruption is in a way the other side. So these are people who want to hoard and hoard and hoard so that they may never ever be poor again, kind of. But they do it in such a, I mean, you know, if you are going to have 40 cars or 15 cars, I don't know what that speaks to. It speaks to a psychological problem and not just an economic problem. If you are to be so rich, but you are unable to go back to the village where you come from to build a toilet for the school, the local school, but you can be able to buy 10 cars or more for yourselves, So we are a messed up people psychologically. And this is not to deny that the economic issues are not real. But what we do have in common, because I'm thinking about violence against women, which Eleanor referred to. Violence against women is done by the poorest men in the squatter camp, by the middle class, by the richest men, by the Indian men, by the black men, by the white men. It leaves no one, because we are a wounded and damaged people, and we are trying to make up for it in very superficial ways instead of dealing with the demon. And I don't think government even begins to understand that at all, unfortunately. So yes, if I were talk about
yeah, you came close to it. Black skins, white masks, Frantz Fanon. Yes. Vavi, my question is just one to you. We have discussed this problem of Afrophobia or Xenophobia, but we have only mentioned in passing one of the root causes of the migrant issue in South Africa, which is the failure of what Eddie calls the Westphalian state, but I call it for the failure of the nation state in Africa, not least in north of the Limpopo. You know the figures in Zimbabwe right now. Literally more than 50% of the adult population is outside the country. 70 to 75% of all skilled professional people, and I was involved at independence in training. And it's sad to see that 70 to 75% of those people are outside the country. Mostly here in mostly where you are in South Africa. And when you hear Zimbabweans given ZAP employment permits, it's not accidental. I mean, it's because there's the recognition and acknowledgement of their skills in that regard. But I think we need to also talk about this, the capability of the neighboring states, the capability of countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia. And I think the narrative is incomplete unless we give equal measure in terms of capability to those countries. How Eddie's idea of an AU conference in which all multi-sectoral participation is guaranteed sounds good, but is there anything that can be done at the regional level, SADC, to bring to the attention of neighboring countries the capability there, Vavi?
I just wanted to add something to what Ndadetinigo Maluleke was saying about the damage psyching of South Africa. Before I answer your question, Comrade Ibo. And I wanted to add one dimension that we should not underplay. The collapsing and the collapse African National Congress as the liberation force in South Africa. The fact that that force is dying faster than what we could imagine or anticipate is a big factor on creating a political vacuum and a glue that for over 100 of years have kept the African majority together because there was a common enemy, the apartheid system, the white settler, the white rule, the national oppression. That liberation force is now in disarray. And that the only a third of the South African voting population still remain hoping that they can change their lot through participating in the election, and that meaning 2/3 of the population no longer believe that they can improve their situation by voting. It's a massive crisis because it is that vacuum. Okay, let me add. There's a vacuum that no one has filled. None of the splinters from the ANC and none of the other forces, political parties, are going anywhere close in replacing that umbrella that united the African people for so long. This is a very, very big factor, and in my view. Just can imagine if this crisis was to create a total collapse of the national unity. There is just no other alternative force that exists in our society today that can, like Nelson Mandela did at the time when Chris Hani was assassinated, call on South African people to unite over anything. That matter is not a small matter. I felt that I must just emphasize in addition to what that was saying. It's a very, very important factor. Now, one therefore missed opportunity, two. Sorry, I have to block this fellow. One missed opportunity was when this big iconic figure, Nelson Mandela, accumulated credibility over 3 decades in prison, was here in the country. We missed 2 opportunities. The first opportunity was a statement from him that would have said, it is time to rebuild a new society. That's the first thing. And the second one was to say, it is time to rebuild the entire region in the context of the devastating impact of the destabilization by the Boer Republic in South Africa. We let go of that opportunity. When we could have picked that pieces up, we had the second president, Thabo Mbeki, coming in, seeing the need for a renewal of the African continent, but unfortunately exporting neoliberal approaches to development through the NEPAD program, which obviously was nothing but the structural adjustment program. We missed the second opportunity. So indeed, the point that I was making, that as long as the poor still see a brighter light elsewhere, they will follow the lighting. It's just natural. People follow development wherever it is. And so that underlines the point that you are making, comrade, that unless we can find a common ground to say, how do we rescue our region and continent from this failed revolution, from the fact that all of us are sitting inside houses written failed state outside? And how do we revive and launch a new struggle of a second liberation, if you can say, and to ensure that the uneven development that forced the poor to migrate is addressed at home. But there's an important issue. It's not just the capabilities of the region that we must talk about. In our view, and I've raised this, and that has made me very, very unpopular, President Mbeki created the crisis in Zimbabwe through denialism. When he forced the government of national unity, he postponed a problem that had a chance of being resolved at the home front. And when the Zimbabwean workers in particular became the victims of that destabilization project, they began to move into South Africa, Botswana, Swaziland, and elsewhere. He would not come back and say, by the way, the Zimbabweans had an opportunity to solve their own problems. And I decided to rather embrace my fellow liberation fighter at the expense of the truth and homegrown solutions by the Zimbabweans themselves. So we are now in a mess. He now says that there is no xenophobia. He knows that his conscience is telling him that his hands are full of blood in terms of being also responsible for the sustained crisis in Zimbabwe that could have been resolved ages ago. So I think that particular aspect must not escape us as we engage about the need to solve the regional crisis, and but also to ensure that this false solidarity amongst the liberation movements from Angola to Namibia. Namibia is doing well now, better. From Namibia to Mozambique to Zimbabwe, South Africa, not on the basis of pushing development, but on the basis of protecting one another against the citizens of their own country, including against the trade unions, is something that we have not really fully debated, because that's where the other crisis is. And now all of them are on a free fall, and with few exceptions, maybe Namibia, as I was saying. Those factors are issues that I think we should discuss.
No, thanks, Vavi. Thanks very much indeed. Eddie, you and I are familiar with this tension, the tension between Pan-Africanism and the nation state. And the Cairo meeting of 1964 was largely a symptom of that tension. After the failure by people like Nkrumah to push the Pan-African agenda to its logical conclusion. And people like Nyerere, as you know, were party to that decision. It was to save the nation state, but now we are here. The nation state has failed. It's pathological. How can we even talk of Pan-Africanism without dealing with the nation state and its failures? How shall we proceed without leaving us being perceived as ideologues full of platitudes, without the mass of the people rejecting Pan-Africanism as a platitude, unachievable, even at a time, especially at a time when the AU is in a poor state. You know, I was in Addis, I think we were there together, and I told you I wouldn't touch, I will never until I enter the AU building, because it stands as an indictment on us as Africans, having something built for us by another nation, however benevolent. It's a serious indictment. So how do we start? This AU-led conference, I mean, we saw. I just come from 2 conferences, workshops rather. There's a new way to go, Eddie. Workshops. We're 10 of us in Nairobi, 20 of us in Lagos last week, dealing with this very issue, the tension between the nation state, which has failed totally, and Pan-Africanism, which is tottering, represented as it is at the AU level. How shall we proceed?
No, very difficult, Ivo. The tension between Pan-Africanism and the nation state is quite difficult, because even Kwame Nkrumah himself, he struggled with it. When he was writing Africa Must Unite, he thought the compromise which was reached because when he came back, his party comrades were saying, but you sold out. He thought, no, it's just a temporary arrangement. So he thought it was a temporary arrangement, and you know that he will not live long after that. 3 years later, he was toppled. So, and thereafter, the military regimes became a common phenomenon on the African continent. Then it was the period of the structural adjustment and so on. And in the 1990s, then that's when you see the the post-colonial African state trying to you could say, to find a new identity. And of course, briefly it went through that period of Mbeki and others, the African Renaissance and all of that. But now we are dealing with this, and it really never managed to realize if there's such a thing as full potential. But it didn't really get to the point that we would have expected. So the question, Ivo, will be whether a scenario, is there a scenario where we will fold the post-colonial African state and say, no, you're not working. Is such a scenario possible, and say you're not working, you're not viable, and so on? The question is, what do we do with them? They are here. How do we move? How do we? I think we have had this debate.
What if it has failed? If it has failed?
Yes, but the question is, the question is, what do we do with it as a reality? And some, maybe our brother Vavi will say that we must organize maybe revolutions within those countries and replace the elites with a revolutionary contingent, and the revolutionary contingent, then they start building or working towards, you could say, a Pan-African project for the 21st century. For me, it's a very, very difficult question. Yes, and the idea that, it is a very difficult question. What do you do with it? Because it's really, it exists. And we can't sleep and wake up, it's no longer there. But it's a reality, is there, but it has all these challenges that all of us on this panel have outlined. The issue, let me just clarify, Ivo, we don't have time. I want to return to the point that I raised earlier, the suggestion of a Pan-African, AU-led Pan-African conference. I know that you know your own reservations about the AU. But what I mean is that we need a mechanism similar to what we have with how the AU responds to unconstitutional change of government or changes of government. There is an established a framework, a doctrine, and also a response guideline. We need something like that, because the way it's happening with these attacks or outbursts or outbreaks in, let's say, in the case of South Africa, we call them Afrophobic. They happen, and South Africa responds with whichever way it's responding, and then countries of nationals who are involved there, then they then say no this, and then they issue their own statements, and some of them resort to asymmetric responses targeting South African interests in their own countries. So for me, I don't think it's a sustainable way. That's why I'm saying we need a Pan-African approach. So that's the context within which I raise the Pan-African issue. So I was not raising it within the framework of the project, a much bigger project that you lead in your other capacity. But I was talking about a Pan-African approach where we develop a Pan-African framework of how, when tomorrow is South Africa, today is South Africa, tomorrow maybe Zimbabwe, tomorrow Kenya. When this thing happens, how do we do? That's why I'm proposing this conference. I'm not saying that is the only thing. That's why I'm saying that in between that, then we must organize multi-sectoral engagement within countries and across the continent. Eleanor, before she left, she raised a very good suggestion of intergenerational Pan-African regeneration or renewal of some sort, and cross-country and so on. But we need some sort of a mechanism that will be actually also rely on scientific methods of any evidence-driven approach. Because it's a very sensitive, it's a very emotional issue to see people being chased in the streets and all of that. But we need an approach where the continent can deal with, where all of us, those whose citizens are there, those who are receiving, the transit countries can sit and say, how collectively do we deal with this? We had this idea before it was adopted by the African Union, and I was involved in trying to operationalize it. But unfortunately, it never took off. And just why I'm saying we need to return to that idea. But this does not exclude other options that are on the table. But my view is that no country can deal with this issue on its own, because it's African people who are involved across the continent, but finding themselves, maybe in one geographic setting, and all these contestations that have been described by colleagues on this panel. and having to, so you can't then point fingers at each other. So collectively as African people, we have to deal with it, but there must be a mechanism. And even at SADC level, such a mechanism can be reproduced, because even with unconstitutional changes of government, the sub-regional economic communities have a role. They actually normally are the ones who are responsible. So SADC could be involved, the AU could be involved, and then there's engagement with South Africa. The teams are sent to the ground. They do their own investigation, their own assessment. They make recommendations. There's an engagement, and so on. So that's really the suggestion that I'm putting on the table. But the bigger issue of the nation state and Pan-Africanism, that one is very difficult for me to answer at this stage. Thank you.
No, it's all right. I don't expect you to answer. It's a problem that we're all confronted with. But I would suggest that we begin with this very panel. And you are at the School of Governance there, and we are SAPIS, and
indeed.
And
Tiniko is there, and he gave very good exampls inspired by literature. The travel, the travel ops.
We consider ourselves into a working group, and we'll keep in touch towards some kind of
that's definitely.
And move forward.
Definitely, yeah. No, we are the School of Governance. We'll be interested in this discussion.
Yeah.
Can you also enjoy yourself there in the Eastern Cape? I can see it's very cold. Sorry, Ivo kept you this long at night in this cold. Ivo, this is abuse. I don't know what we call when elders abuse some of us who came after them. But
I like this discussion, because I'm meeting new people. We have a rich resource base of intellectuals in the region, and I'm grateful to Eleanor suggesting Tiniko, and also the VAVI is an institution in our region.
Yeah, and then he cited Askia Patele's books that I haven't read in many years. That one, the book you cited, I think I read it when I was at high school. So you really
those references are very profound.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ivo. Good night. Yeah. Thanks.
Good night, Vavi. Good night. Thanks very much.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Keep in touch. I'll be in touch with you again towards the workshop. Yeah, we'll have a conversation.
Okay.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Keep up the good work, Vavi. We are with you.
Cheers.
Yes.
Cheers. Keep up the. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Africa, oh, di panda. gusto con